Well, thank you, Mitchell, and it's great to be here. What a great review of global trends that we just saw. And my aha moment was the slide about the clergy not being replaced by robots, because suddenly I now understand why we're having this meeting in a former church. But you heard what Mitchell and Ed were talking about and the kind of lineup you've got of experts today. The concept that I would like to talk about is what underlies all of these trends, and that's the change in the way we connect. Because how we connect defines who we are. And so the very simple concept that I'd like to leave you with today is this: we look like our pet. And what are we going to do about it, other than helping this woman with her unfortunate haircut? This is actually something that I first heard expressed at the CIA. And if you stop and think about it, the challenge that the intelligence community has had is that they have had to move from an environment where their adversary was centralized, top-down, using centralized networks, to a situation where their adversary is distributed. And how do they change? So the nature of how networks connect us have changed the nature of intelligence gathering. Because it used to be, hey, you want to get intelligence from the Soviet Union, you got a couple of places you tap into, thank you very much, you got it. Now we're living in the world of all the distributed terrorists. And how do you gather that kind of information? So I tried to take that approach back, the thought back to the FCC when I was chairman. You know, I stand here as a recovering regulator. And as I looked at what we were dealing with, because the FCC has oversight responsibility for 1/6 of the American economy. All of the networks, cable, satellite, telephone, internet, you name it, we had responsibility for it. But what was important wasn't that it was just 1/6 of the economy, but that the other 5/6 used it. And that meant that the other 5/6 ended up having the you look like your pet situation, because how we connect defines both commerce and culture. And so if you look like your pet, the question is, what are you going to do about it? Because we know that those networks are changing. So let's take a look at this from a historical perspective. From the beginning of time, networks have looked like this. I don't care whether it was rail yards or switchboards. The boxcars came into a central place and got rerouted. The calls came into a central place and got rerouted. Today's network looks like this. It's no longer centralized. It's distributed. And at network activity points, other economic activity occurs. Chicago became the second city because of the fact that everything coming in from the plains would get switched and rerouted east in Chicago. And that's where you slaughtered animal, milled the grain, and there developed an economy to support the butchers and the millers. We're moving from an environment where our networks were a centripetal force to one where they're becoming a centrifugal force, pushing activity out. And the people who have been the winners thus far have been those who recognized that change and took advantage of it. You walk around Facebook headquarters, for instance, and you see this sign everywhere, and I mean literally everywhere. It's in cutout letters pasted on walls, it's in felt pens, it's in yarn pieces put together. Move fast and break the rules. It's everywhere. And Facebook and its kin have realized that the force of the network has changed and took advantage of it. Here's a statistic that'll blow you away. 52% of the Fortune 500 companies at the turn of the century, only 17 years ago, 52% of the Fortune 500 companies don't exist anymore. Now, we all know the classic examples. The largest taxi company owns no cars. The largest hotelier owns no beds. But here's one for you. The number of driver's licenses issued is declining. And the decline is being led by teenagers. Now, I don't know about you, but the first thing I did on my 16th birthday, which, by the way, is 55 years ago today, the first thing I did after getting out of class was to go to the DMV and get my driver's license. But today, kids are constantly connected. We were connected. Hello, we would talk to each other on the phone. That was an occasional connection. Now you're constantly connected. And when you need to get from point A to point B, you pull out your smartphone and you hit Uber. And so there's a decline in the number of driver's licenses because we have moved from a network that centralizes services to a network that distributes activities, and both commerce and culture have evolved with that because we look like our pet. Now, I loved what Ed and Mitchell were doing with this app that you've got, and I want to go to some audience participation here in a second. But let's set up the question that we're going to talk about. The last great network revolution was in the middle of the 19th century. It was the first high-speed network, which was the railroad, and the first electronic network, which was the telegraph. And it accelerated, it put force behind this centripetal drive and created the Industrial Revolution. The slide in the lower left-hand corner, the chart in the lower left-hand corner, is what's really interesting here, because this is the growth in urban areas, in factory cities. And look at how it is exactly the same as the growth in the networks. The networks drove the centralized factory economy, which produced great productivity increases. Let me be specific. To produce a plow, 2 blacksmiths doing 11 tasks took 118 hours. That same plow, produced on the factory floor by 52 men, broken down into 97 tasks, took 3 3/4 hours. Now that is a productivity gain. But you think about what Mitchell and Ed were just telling us. The last network revolution had those kinds of transformational productivity gains. Where is that transformational productivity increase today? You may recall this statement that was made by Robert Solow, the Nobel laureate economist, a few years ago. You can see the computer age everywhere but in the productivity statistics. And last year, Robert Gordon, economics professor at Northwestern, dove down into that and traced American productivity for the last 150 years. And this is what he found. In the post-digital era, productivity growth is lower than it has been for the last 140, 150 years. And yes, there was a blip in the late 90s and early 2000s as the PC really became ubiquitous, but then it settled back down again. Gordon answered that question as to why that Mitchell and Ed were asking a minute ago. Gordon answered that question. And he said, advances since 1970 have tended to be channeled into entertainment, communications, and the collection and processing of information. For the rest of what humans care about, progress has slowed down. So, with that as an underpinning, and based on the kind of work you've already done with Mitchell and Ed, let's do a new poll. Digital networks have yet to be as transformational in business and production activities as they have been in consumer-facing activities. Vote 1 if you strongly agree, and 5 if you strongly disagree. And let's see what the opinion is here. And I also want to remind everybody, you can vote in between if you want, but remember what they say in Texas, that, the only thing you find in the middle of the road are yellow stripes and dead armadillos. So we've got some middle-of-the-roaders here. Okay, so we've got a strong belief. Over 50% of the people here agree with the statement that we have not yet been as transformational in non-consumer-facing activities, to which my answer is, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because I think we are now on the cusp of being able to change this. Because, excuse me, for the last several decades, two forces have been circling each other, kind of like teenagers at a party. So this is where I get serious. And this is where we have our conversation about sex. Because as these forces circled each other, a lot of things happened. One of those forces was Moore's Law. You heard it referenced earlier. Gordon Moore, the co-founder of Intel, and he posited that in 1965 that about every 24 months, the computing power of a microchip would double and the cost would fall. And for 50 years, it's kept on that upward path. Just for an analogy purpose, if the automobile had seen those kind of improvements, you'd be able to drive your car for a year on a tank of gas. if the miniaturization that had occurred in microchips had happened to automobile, the car that I drove to the prom would be the size of an ant. And of course, as one wag has pointed out, if automobiles behave like computer chips, they'd crash once a year and lose everything inside. But about 15 years into Moore's Law, one of those iterations of chips gave birth to the next big trend: wireless connectivity. This is a chart of the growth in the number of wireless subscribers around the world. There are now more subscribers to wireless services than there are people on the planet. And how many of you have 2 phones that you're carrying today? There's the answer to that. What's significant about this chart is not the number of subscribers, but it is the infrastructure that has enabled that to happen. Because whether it's a licensed network or an unlicensed network or a private network, there is now ubiquity of communication throughout the world. And what has happened is that, bang, these two have now had sex and are producing a new reality for us, where everything is intelligent and everything is connected. And this is going to be the driving force in the next iteration of the networks that define who we are. Let's look at an example. To understand this, you need to go back and think about, how did the internet really become the tool for us? Well, it was the birth of the web, the World Wide Web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee in late 80s, early 90s. And the idea that you could go have a common method for finding information and displaying it across this myriad of different networks and myriad of different databases. And that built the model of the web, which is a call response. About a dozen years later, Web 2.0 came along, which really democratized what we were seeing, created the social media that we know today, where you can feed information up into the web and then call it back down. But it was still the call and response. The result of the combination of microprocessing and ubiquitous wireless connectivity is going to stand that on its head and produce a world in which we have N+1 microchips that are delivering intelligence into the network, and that intelligence creates new products and new productivity. We have gone from call response to intelligence being created and how you use that intelligence being the definition of the effect of that new network. Let me give you an example. We all know the connected car. We all drive the connected car. Waze, tell me how to get there. Multiple other pieces of information that we get. It is call response. It is existing information that exists out here in the cloud that we're pulling down. But when we move to autonomous vehicles, then, whoops, I've gone too fast here. There, when we move to autonomous vehicles, the microchips in the car are pumping out intelligence that needs to be orchestrated to create a new product. And that new product is the ability of cars and trucks to get around without hitting each other. And that new product has a huge productivity impact as well. It's estimated that each car and truck will generate about 25 gigabytes of data every hour. Put that in perspective, that's more than a house full of teenagers uses in multiple days. And that information is being generated and has to be orchestrated to create a new product. Here's just a list of some of the things that are projected to come in terms of products and productivity from the autonomous vehicle, which is just one manifestation of Internet 3.0. But it's not just vehicles, and we all know it's going to be a little while until we see fully autonomous cars on the road. But the first iteration, the first act of Web 3.0 is the Internet of Things. It's forecast that by 2030, which is 3 years away, 2020, which is 3 years away, that there will be 20 to 50 billion, with a B, microchips out creating the Internet of Things. Again, chips in everything and wirelessly connected. The chart is just an example of the kind of money that's being invested in that now. So let's recap for a second here. We have moved from a web that was call and response to a web that is creating intelligence in N+1 devices, and that intelligence then is being fed to the network and into an environment where it has to be orchestrated so that that orchestration creates a new product. And that changes our relationship with the network. And it changes it in multiple ways. We have moved from the delivery of information to the collection of intelligence. Information exists out here and is pulled down. Intelligence is something that has to be formed to create a product. And that means we have moved from transportation to orchestration. And that orchestration changes the business model. Because we move from a push environment to a pull environment. We move from value being created by pushing information to targeted audiences to value being created by pulling intelligence to create new products and new productivity. And the network is also going to give us the tools necessary to pull that off. So for instance, we need to have trust. We need to have counterparty trust. How do you identify and validate every single device and know really that's the one that's producing the right kind of intelligence? The answer lies in blockchain, in the distributed ledger of blockchain. And what does blockchain look like? It looks like that new network. All of the data, all of the intelligence coming out of these N+1 chips are going to flood us with the need for computational capabilities. And what is that? Well, that requires artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this afternoon in your session on AI, I'm sure you'll hear the term neural networks for how the computing capacity is all hooked together. It looks just like the network. And of course, we're going to have to worry about security. How do you eliminate both network and data vulnerability? The whole issue of cybersecurity. I was responsible for the cybersecurity of the networks that connect us. The solution that was too easy to choose was, well, we'll have some kind of a centralized solution. No. The solution looks like the network. The solution to cybersecurity is out there at the edges of the network. So, this is the point in a presentation like this where I say, okay, and now here are the answers. But unfortunately, time is running out. And besides, somebody says I got all the answers, you ought to start heading for the exits. But one of the things that we do know, what are the things that we do know that can help us find what the answers are? Well, the first thing that we know is it's never the primary network that is transformational. It is the secondary effect of that network. It wasn't the railroad that was transformational. It was what was in the boxcars that rode on the railroad. And so as we move from a centralized network to a distributed network, it is the effect, it is that centrifugal force that we need to be attuned to because we look like our networks. And those that have been winners in this environment have been those who have seen this redirection and have taken advantage of it. We now know that there is another step coming after this redirection, and that is the move to N+1 ubiquitously connected intelligence producers. That will change business by creating value, by using intelligence rather than transporting intelligence. And will make us think about how do we build business models based upon pull economics instead of push economics. So, how we connect defines who we are. In 1990, few imagined the impact of being able to connect with all the information of the world. In 2002, few anticipated what would happen with the democratization of the web and the creation of social media, the ability to upload your YouTube videos or Netflix videos, or the ability of the President of the United States to tweet. Today, we are at another network transformational moment. We know what it looks like. The technology has an ability, has a habit of just moving inexorably forward. But it is how we use technology that is key, and that's something that you and I control. And so the challenge that we have going forward is knowing that we look like our networks, that the networks are changing again, and that it's up to us to determine how we are going to take advantage of that. Thank you very much.
Don't go anywhere, Tom. We have a number of questions for you. But interestingly, the number one comment from the crowd, happy birthday.
Thank you.
So,
you know, 70 is the new 60. That's the way I look at it.
I was doing the math. I think it wasn't 70, was it?
71.
Okay, there you go.
I'm 71. That's right. I'm sorry. I just did.
Anyway, so
I had to do the math on the fly up
Right,
here.
sorry about that.
And I'm kind of proud of myself that I figured that out.
well, thanks. One of the questions, a great question from the audience, and it goes back to the chart you were showing about population growth following the networks. Yeah. So if the networks are now all distributed, what are the implications for rural populations? Is it going to change? Is it going to change where population is and where people are working and what they're doing?
That's a great question. Absolutely. And one of the things that we did when I was at the FCC, we run a $4 billion a year program in which we put a little fee on your phone bills and redirect it towards broadband connectivity in rural America. And we've still got a crisis in this country in that about 10% of American population is not connected. You cannot exist in the 21st century if you don't have a broadband connection. And so it is really important. But now let me tell you a really quick story about this, because I've seen this in action. I went down to McKee, Kentucky, which is in the heart of coal country. And we all know from what the president's been saying how much the coal economy has been devastated. McKee has one traffic light, and the entire town has been wired with fiber. They have more people employed in McKee today than they did 5 years ago, because they're performing services online. I met with coal miners who have learned to code and are coding for Microsoft and Apple and other Silicon Valley in what they're now calling Silicon Holler in eastern Kentucky. But the key is you must be connected, and that's remains a major policy challenge.
Well, that's great. I think that's going to be, I think we should all hold the thought of the retraining when we talk about later about technology replacing jobs and what it means for where we're employed and how we're employed in the future. But one more question for you. When you think about the evolution of networks, and Ed and I were talking about, we seem to be living through a technological revolution, and every decade we have some group of technologists who claim they're part of the next technological revolution, whether there was, nuclear science in the 50s or space travel in the 60s. We're all living we're all living through a revolution. And, it's a little Willy Loman-esque in Death of a Salesman. We're sort of always on the cusp. We're right there. We're about to achieve greatness. And you're saying that now also. Why is this time different? Why are we really on the cusp this time?
Well, I think that, we always, the tendency is we're very self-centered, okay? And of course, everything that's happening has to be the greatest thing that has ever happened. I don't think that we are yet at the level of network-driven revolution that we saw in the middle of the 19th century with the first high-speed network, the railroad, and the first electronic network, the telegraph, that happened bam, bam, literally just a few years apart. And totally transformed the nation's economy. But I do think we are on the cusp, and the kinds of things that I talked about there at the end, that AI, VR, blockchain, and cyber are the issues that will determine whether or not we indeed cross over the chasm, if you will, to enter into a truly transformational moment. And a key to that is the whole issue of how do we deal with the new network reality of Web 3.0 and the fact that it's not the old game anymore.
One last question. We have a lot of good questions from the audience, and I apologize we can't take them all, but Tom will certainly be around for another little while, so hopefully you can get him. But one question, also very interesting, is centralized government systems. Governments are centralized. How are centralized governments going to be dealing and changing and adjusting to distributed network systems and the distribution of their populations, socially, economically?
We could go all day on that, but let me just do so the result of the Industrial Revolution was to create, and the centralizing force of those networks was to create big production capabilities. And to keep up with that, big labor came into being. And to keep up with both of them, big government came into being. And we followed, for each of those, the same model that had been followed in the Industrial Revolution, which is the centralization of authority. So here's a classic example, the education system. So the Industrial Revolution, we need people who can read manuals and do basic math. So we take the factory approach to education, and we say we're going to take a raw material and put it in, and it's going to go through 12 processing stages, and at the end, it is going to produce a finished product, an educated workforce. That kind of centralized thinking we applied to everything. Let's have a big centralized government, let's have big centralized labor, and it can't work that way anymore. What we were trying to do at the FCC during my chairmanship was to say, how do we bust that paradigm and come up with a new paradigm? That instead of coming in and saying, we know best, here is how you should manage the network, that instead we say, okay, here's the basic frame of what we need to have in terms of a social compact. Operate inside there, and we'll stand here as a referee on the field and call balls and strikes. And so government needs to change in the way it approaches things, and it's difficult for government to change because government is actually set up not to change. The structures are organized that way. But I think that is a great and very perceptive question that we could talk about forever.
Well, thank you again. We really appreciate it. We're honored, and we're all lucky to have you here, and this was terrific.
Mitchell, thank you very much. It's been
Thank you.
great.